She's my teacher, and somehow, every look she gives me feels like a secret just between us. The late afternoon sunlight poured through the tall classroom windows, casting warm, golden slants across the polished wooden floors. The hum of the air conditioner and the faint scent of chalk dust created an oddly comforting quiet, the kind that only comes when the world has emptied out and left just the two of you. I lingered by my desk, pretending to organize papers, but my attention kept drifting toward her, my teacher, Mrs. Aldrich. She moved through the room with a kind of effortless grace, her heels clicking softly, her posture poised yet relaxed. I had always noticed her, not in the way everyone notices a teacher, but in a way that made ordinary things feel charged. How she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the slight arch of her brow when she concentrated, or the way her laughter, soft and melodic, seemed to linger in the air longer than necessary. She was older than me, by a decade or more, and yet there was something in her presence that felt quietly approachable, as if she were a secret waiting to be discovered. I reached for a stack of graded papers, and in that moment, our hands brushed. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a subtle jolt through me. Her fingers lingered a heartbeat longer than they should have, and I felt heat creep into my chest, my pulse catching in a rhythm that seemed all too noticeable. She glanced at me, her eyes holding a spark of something I couldn't quite name, a flicker of amusement. Curiosity. Recognition. I wasn't sure, and part of me hoped I'd imagined it. I forced myself to focus on the papers, but the warmth of her presence clung to me, like sunlight on skin after stepping out of shade. There was a careful balance in her demeanor, professional, composed, yet somehow disarmingly personal in the smallest gestures. I wondered if she noticed the way my gaze lingered, or the way my voice faltered slightly when I spoke. I wondered if she felt the same pull I felt, that subtle tension that existed only when the world is quiet, and the mundane suddenly feels extraordinary. We exchanged a few polite words, casual and fleeting, but beneath them, an undercurrent of unspoken understanding simmered. My internal conflict grew, part of me knew the societal boundaries, knew the age difference and the roles we held, but another part, quieter yet persistent, couldn't help but notice the magnetic pull between us. It was the kind of tension that starts as a whisper, a flutter in your chest, but promises something more if you're patient enough to let it unfold. And as she walked to the door, pausing briefly to glance back at me with a smile that was both fleeting and unforgettable, I realized that this was only the beginning. After the last student had left, the classroom felt like a small, private world suspended in the golden haze of late afternoon. I lingered, pretending to organize my notes, though really I was waiting for her to notice me, or perhaps just to share a moment that felt impossibly rare. Mrs. Aldrich moved around the room with her usual calm efficiency, stacking papers, straightening chairs, her presence filling the space with a quiet warmth. There was a rhythm to her movements, a subtle grace that made even the mundane task of tidying up seem effortless. I offered to help with the stacks of graded assignments, and she looked up, a flicker of surprise softening her features. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice low and gentle, carrying that hint of humor that always made me feel like we were sharing a secret. I nodded, careful not to let my hands betray the nervous flutter in my chest. As I bent down to gather the papers, our hands brushed again, this time not by accident. She looked at me then, her eyes holding a quiet curiosity that made my pulse skip. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk, paper, and her perfume, a delicate, lingering fragrance that somehow made the ordinary feel extraordinary. As we worked side by side, I noticed the subtle cues of her attention, the way she shifted closer when reaching for a paper, the way her hand rested briefly on my shoulder to point something out, the gentle tilt of her head when she listened to me speak. Each gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but together they created a language I was beginning to understand, a language that said, without words, that this moment was shared, exclusive, and quietly intimate. She laughed softly at something I said, a light, melodic sound that seemed to hang in the warm air. I caught myself smiling before I realized it, feeling an unexpected thrill at the simple exchange. There was a comfort in her presence, yes, but also an undercurrent of something more, something tender and unspoken, like the first ripple of a slow-burning flame. My heart felt both lighter and more aware at once, attuned to the rhythm of our small interactions. Yet beneath the warmth, there was tension. The age difference, the teacher-student dynamic, the silent rules we were both aware of, they hovered at the edges of every glance, every movement. And still, in that quiet classroom, amidst the rustle of papers and the fading sunlight, I realized that this shared moment was not just ordinary kindness. It was the beginning of something more, a connection that was subtle, unspoken, and impossible to ignore. When she finally gathered her things to leave, our eyes met once more. There was a fleeting spark there, a shared acknowledgement of what had passed between us, delicate yet undeniable. And in that glance, I felt the thrill of anticipation, knowing that this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. It was one of those quiet afternoons where the school corridors seemed impossibly long, the distant echoes of lockers and empty classrooms fading into a comforting hush. I was gathering my books, my mind still replaying the brief moments we had shared in the classroom the day before, her laugh, the brush of her hand, the soft warmth of her presence. And then I saw her. Mrs. Aldrich was standing near the far end of the hallway, leaning lightly against the doorframe of an empty classroom. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught her hair, setting it aglow with shades of amber and chestnut. She wasn't doing anything remarkable, simply reviewing a set of notes, but somehow, even the mundane carried an elegance that made me pause. Our eyes met across the hallway, and for a heartbeat, everything else disappeared. She held my gaze longer than was necessary, a subtle flicker of curiosity and amusement in her eyes. I felt a rush of awareness, every sense sharpening. The faint smell of her perfume drifted toward me, soft and familiar, mingling with the warm, sunlit air. I noticed the delicate way she adjusted her scarf, the tilt of her head, the small curl of her fingers around her notebook. Every gesture was small, intimate, and strangely magnetic. I forced myself to glance away, pretending to straighten my bag, but the pull was magnetic. When I dared to look back, she was still watching, a small, knowing smile playing at her lips. It wasn't bold or overt, it was quiet, subtle, and infinitely more tantalizing for it. In that fleeting silence, I felt a connection form, unspoken and electric. It was as though we shared a private language, a delicate understanding that existed only in glances and pauses. My chest tightened with a mixture of excitement and restraint. The age gap, the teacher-student boundaries, they loomed silently in my mind, reminding me to be careful, to measure every step. And yet, the magnetic pull of her attention was undeniable, a gentle current I could neither resist nor explain. I wondered if she felt the same tension, the same flutter of anticipation in these stolen moments of quiet observation. As I turned the corner to leave, I caught one last glance. Her eyes held mine just long enough to imprint the memory in a way I knew I wouldn't forget, the warmth, the curiosity, the subtle, unspoken invitation to see her again. My heart thudded in my chest, and for the first time, I realized that this wasn't simply admiration or fleeting attraction. It was something deeper, something quietly powerful, a slow-burning connection that neither of us could fully acknowledge yet, but both were keenly aware of. And in that lingering look, I understood, this was only the beginning of a story that would unfold in whispers, glances, and moments that the world around us might never see. The classroom was quiet again, bathed in the soft, golden light of the late afternoon. I lingered behind, pretending to review notes, while Mrs. Aldrich moved with her usual composed grace, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. There was a calmness about her that made the world outside feel distant, as if time itself had slowed for the brief bubble we shared. She picked up a paper I had submitted earlier and gave it a casual glance, her lips curving into a small, amused smile. "You forgot to cross this T," she said lightly, tapping the page with her finger. There was nothing harsh or disciplinary in her tone, it was playful, gentle, and yet there was an intimacy in the way her gaze lingered on me, as though teasing me with something just beyond my grasp. I felt my chest tighten, a small shiver running down my spine at the subtle intensity in her eyes. "Guess I need a refresher in punctuation," I replied, keeping my voice steady, though my hands were betraying me with a slight tremor. Her smile widened, and she leaned closer to point at the paper. Her hand brushed against mine, not forceful, not overt, but lingering enough that I felt the warmth of her skin against mine. The contact was brief, yet it sent a quiet thrill through me, a reminder that the ordinary could feel extraordinary in her presence. I looked up and noticed the subtle softness in her expression, the way her brow arched in that familiar, graceful way that made my heart skip a beat. There was humor, yes, but beneath it, a quiet warmth, a personal connection that I couldn't quite define. Every gesture was charged with unspoken meaning, every glance carrying a tension that neither of us named aloud. It was a confession in disguise, small, playful, yet brimming with something more profound than either of us could say outright. The rustle of papers, the faint smell of her perfume mingling with the warm afternoon air, and the soft creak of the chairs created a cocoon around us, a private moment suspended in time. I realized then that it wasn't just her teasing or my playful responses that made my chest tighten, it was the shared understanding that we were treading a delicate line between propriety and desire, curiosity and restraint. As she straightened and gave me one last glance, a quiet spark of recognition passed between us. It wasn't a declaration, and it wasn't bold, but it was enough. Enough to make the ordinary classroom feel like a world of its own, enough to plant the seed of something slowly, quietly growing between us. And as I gathered my things to leave, I couldn't shake the thought that this playful confession was just the beginning, hinting at moments yet to come, moments I already found myself anticipating with quiet, eager anticipation. It happened on one of those rare afternoons when the school felt utterly empty, the distant echoes of students and lockers replaced by a soft, almost sacred silence. I had stayed behind to help Mrs. Aldrich gather some materials for an upcoming lesson. The golden sunlight slanted through the tall windows, painting the room in hues of amber and honey. Everything about the scene, the quiet, the warm light, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the crisp smell of paper, felt charged with possibility. She was bent over a low shelf, reaching for a stack of textbooks, and I stepped forward to assist. As I passed her, my hand brushed against hers. The contact was light, accidental, or so it seemed, but it sent a ripple of warmth up my arm and a shiver down my spine. I looked at her, and our eyes met. There was no teasing this time, no playful smile, just a pause, a mutual recognition of something unspoken, something quietly electric. "Be careful with that," I said, noticing the precarious stack she held. She laughed softly, a sound that seemed to linger longer than usual, and then, for the first time, the conversation shifted. She spoke not of grades or lessons, but of her day, of small frustrations and fleeting joys, and I found myself listening, not as a student, not as a subordinate, but as someone sharing a private, fleeting intimacy. When she dropped a small notebook on the floor, I bent to pick it up. Our hands met again, and this time I didn't pull away immediately. I felt the warmth of her fingers, the softness of her skin, and for a heartbeat, we simply held the notebook together, our gazes locked. There was a subtle vulnerability in the way she looked at me, a quiet openness that was unexpected from someone so composed. I felt the magnetic pull of her presence, the kind that makes the air feel thicker, more alive, and every movement seem weighty with unspoken meaning. We lingered in the silence, not needing words. The rustle of pages, the distant hum of the ventilation, and the golden light all conspired to create a world that existed solely for the two of us. I realized then that our connection was more than fleeting attraction, it was understanding. A recognition of shared moments, of subtle glances, of touches that lingered just long enough to matter. When she finally straightened, there was a quiet acknowledgement in her eyes, a fleeting warmth that neither of us named aloud. I felt my heart race, both exhilarated and cautious, aware of the fragile boundary we were navigating. And yet, even with the tension, there was a profound comfort in that private understanding, an unspoken promise that our story was slowly, quietly unfolding, one lingering touch, one glance, one shared moment at a time. The school seemed quieter than usual that evening, the corridors empty and almost reverent in the fading light. I was supposed to leave, but I found myself lingering, my footsteps soft on the polished floor, my mind replaying the small, intimate moments I had shared with Mrs. Aldrich over the past weeks. And then she appeared, unexpected, calm, radiant as ever, leaning against the edge of the classroom door. The sunlight caught her hair, casting a halo around her, and I realized I hadn't truly breathed since I saw her last. Our eyes met, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. She smiled, a subtle, knowing smile that wasn't playful this time, but quiet and almost intimate. There was an unspoken question in that glance, a flicker of acknowledgement that mirrored the pull I felt deep in my chest. My pulse quickened, and I was acutely aware of every detail, the warmth of her skin, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the dusty air of the classroom, the delicate tilt of her head that made her look both graceful and approachable at once. As I approached, we both reached for the same folder on the desk. Our hands brushed deliberately this time, fingers grazing lightly. I felt a shiver run through me, a mix of exhilaration and restraint. She didn't pull away immediately, and the silence that stretched between us was heavy with meaning. It was a charged moment, one that seemed to vibrate in the air, silent but undeniable. "I didn't expect anyone to stay behind," she said softly, her voice steady but carrying an undertone I couldn't quite place. I smiled, trying to mask the racing of my heart. "Guess I needed a reason," I replied, leaving the sentence unfinished. There was humor, yes, but also tension, an almost tangible anticipation hanging in the air. We moved slightly closer, exchanging papers, each movement slow, deliberate, weighted with unspoken desire. My gaze flicked to hers repeatedly, catching tiny, telling details, the way her lips curved subtly, the soft sigh she released when she shifted the papers, the lingering look she offered as if daring me to acknowledge the connection between us. I felt the magnetic pull stronger than ever, the line between propriety and longing blurred, and yet, neither of us crossed it. Every heartbeat felt amplified, every breath a quiet acknowledgement of what we both wanted but couldn't voice. The age gap, the social boundaries, the weight of roles we held, all hovered like shadows at the edge of the moment, heightening the intensity rather than diminishing it. When she finally straightened, the briefest touch of her hand against my arm as she passed me was enough to leave a lingering warmth. The tension remained, thick and potent, a promise that our story was reaching a crescendo, but one carefully measured, delicate, and filled with anticipation. The classroom was bathed in the soft, amber glow of sunset, the fading light spilling through the tall windows and casting long, gentle shadows across the floor. The school was quiet now, a hushed sanctuary where every sound, the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway, the rustle of papers, the faint hum of the ventilation, seemed amplified in its intimacy. I stayed behind, feeling a pull I couldn't resist, knowing she would still be here. Mrs. Aldridge looked up from her desk as I approached, and for a moment, we simply regarded each other. No words, just the quiet understanding that had been building between us over weeks of small, shared moments. Her eyes softened as she gave me that familiar, knowing smile, one that had become almost a private language, an unspoken conversation in glances, gestures, and pauses. "I'll pretend this never happened," she said quietly, her voice carrying that calm, composed tone she always wore, though there was a warmth beneath it that made my chest tighten. The words were casual, almost playful, but the slight curve of her lips, the gentle tilt of her head, told me she wasn't entirely serious. I smiled in return, my own voice quiet, careful, yet carrying all the meaning I didn't need to speak aloud. "Until next time," I replied, letting the words hang between us. There was no rush, no pressure, just a tender acknowledgement of the connection we had shared, a promise that our story wasn't over, just paused, waiting for the right moment to continue. As she stood and gathered her things, she moved with her usual elegance, yet there was a subtle ease in her posture, a quiet vulnerability she allowed only in these moments. When our hands brushed briefly as she handed me a paper, I felt the warmth linger longer than expected. It was a touch that carried all the weight of unspoken feelings, trust, affection, curiosity, and the tentative thrill of possibility. We walked toward the door together, side by side, though neither of us spoke. There was a comfortable closeness in our pace, the kind that made ordinary movements feel deliberate, meaningful. Her presence was a quiet comfort, yet it carried an electric undercurrent that kept my senses alert, my heart aware of every small gesture. When we reached the threshold, she paused and looked at me one last time, her eyes holding that soft, intimate understanding we had cultivated. It wasn't bold, it wasn't a declaration, but it was enough. Enough to promise that our story had only just begun, that there would be more shared moments, more glances, more small touches that would continue to weave the delicate, unspoken connection between us. And as I left the room, the golden light fading behind me, I carried with me the quiet warmth of that evening, the lingering thrill of her presence, and the certainty that this was not an ending, but a gentle, hopeful beginning. If you enjoyed this slow burn story of forbidden attraction and quiet connection, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of our age gap romance series. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in this story?